The Eastern Window by E.G. Swain and read by Christopher Halton. Tonight's tale is The Eastern Window by E.G. Swain, first published in 1927 as part of the collection The Stoneground Ghost Tales, issued by Ernest Benn Limited of London. Swain, an Anglican clergyman with a deep affection for England's ancient churches and villages, possessed a remarkable gift for blending the familiar with the uncanny. Rather than relying upon sudden shocks, his stories build patiently, allowing the atmosphere itself to become unsettling as the supernatural gradually intrudes upon everyday life. In The Eastern Window, an ancient church once again becomes the stage for strange and disturbing events, as old stones, forgotten history, and quiet devotion intertwine. The boundary between the past and the present begins to dissolve, reminding us that some places may preserve more than memories within their walls. So dim the lights, settle back, and join me as we step into another forgotten masterpiece of classic supernatural fiction. This is The Eastern Window by E.G. Swain. It may well be that Vermuyden and the Dutchman who drained the fens did good, and that it was interred with their bones. It is quite certain that they did evil, and that it lives after them. The rivers which these men robbed of their water have at length silted up, and the drainage of one tract of country is proving to have been achieved by the undraining of another. Places like Stoneground, which lie on the banks of these defrauded rivers, are now become helpless victims of Dutch engineering. The water, which has lost its natural outlet, invades their lands. The thrifty cottager who once had the river at the bottom of his garden has his garden more often in these days, at the bottom of the river, and a summer flood not infrequently destroys the whole produce of his ground. Such a flood during an early year in the 20th century had been unusually disastrous to Stoneground, and Mr. Batchel, who as a gardener was well able to estimate the losses of his poorer neighbours, was taking some steps towards repairing them. Money, however, is never at rest in Stoneground, and it turned out upon this occasion that the funds placed at his command were wholly inadequate to the charitable purpose assigned to them. It seemed as if those who had lost a rood of potatoes could be compensated for no more than a yard. It was at this time, when he was oppressed in mind by the failure of his charitable enterprise, that Mr. Batchel met with the happy adventure in which the eastern window of the church played so singular a part. The narrative should be prefaced by a brief description of the window in question. It is a large painted window of a somewhat unfortunate period of execution. The drawing and colouring leave everything to be desired. The scheme of the window, however, is based upon a wholesome tradition. The 5 large lights in the lower part are assigned to 5 scenes in the life of our Lord, and the second of these, counting from the north, contains a bold erect figure of St. John Baptist, to whom the church is dedicated. It is this figure alone of all those contained in the window that is concerned in what we have to relate. It has already been mentioned that Mr. Batchel had some knowledge of music. He took an interest in the choir, from whose practices he was seldom absent, and was quite competent, in the occasional absence of the choir master, to act as his deputy. It is customary at Stoneground for the choir master, in order to save the sexton a journey, to extinguish the lights after a choir practice and to lock up the church. These duties accordingly were performed by Mr. Batchel when the need arose. It will be of use to the reader to have the procedure in detail. The large gas meter stood in an aisle of the church, and it was Mr. Batchel's practice to go round and extinguish all the lights save one before turning off the gas at the meter. The one remaining light, which was reached by standing upon a choir seat, was always that nearest the door of the chancel, and experience proved that there was ample time to walk from the meter to that light before it died out. It was therefore an easy matter to turn off the last light, to find the door without its aid, and thence to pass out, and close the church for the night. Upon the evening of which we have to speak, the choir had hurried out as usual, as soon as the word had been given. Mr. Batchel had remained to gather together some of the books they had left in disorder, and then turned out the lights in the manner already described. But as soon as he had extinguished the last light, his eye fell, as he descended carefully from the seat, upon the figure of the Baptist. There was just enough light outside to make the figures visible in the eastern window, and Mr. Batchel saw the figure of St. John raise the right arm to its full extent, and point northward, turning its head, at the same time, so as to look him full in the face. These movements were 3 times repeated, and after that the figure came to rest in its normal and familiar position. The reader will not suppose, any more than Mr. Batchel supposed, that a figure painted upon glass had suddenly been endowed with the power of movement, but that there had been the appearance of movement admitted of no doubt, and Mr. Batchel was not so incurious as to let the matter pass without some attempt at investigation. It must be remembered, too, that an experience in the old library, which has been previously recorded, had predisposed him to give attention to signs which another man might have wished to explain away. He was not willing, therefore, to leave this matter where it stood. He was quite prepared to think that his eye had been deceived, but was none the less determined to find out what had deceived it. One thing he had no difficulty in deciding. If the movement had not been actually within the Baptist's figure, it had been immediately behind it. Without delay, therefore, he passed out of the church and locked the door after him, with the intention of examining the other side of the window. Every inhabitant of Stoneground knows and laments the ruin of the old manor house. Its loss by fire some 15 years ago was a calamity from which the parish has never recovered. The estate was acquired soon after the destruction of the house by speculators who have been unable to turn it to any account, and it has for a decade or longer been let alone, except by the forces of nature and the wantonness of trespassers. The charred remains of the house still project above the surrounding heaps of fallen masonry, which have long been overgrown by such vegetation as thrives on neglected ground. And what was once a stately house with its garden and park in fine order has given place to a scene of desolation and ruin. Stoneground Church was built some 600 years ago within the enclosure of the manor house, or as it was anciently termed, the burystead, and an excellent stratum of gravel such as no builder would wisely disregard brought the house and church unusually near together. In more primitive days, the nearness probably caused no inconvenience, but when change and progress affected the popular idea of respectful distance, the churchyard came to be separated by a substantial stone wall of sufficient height to secure the privacy of the house. The change was made with necessary regard to economy of space. The eastern wall of the church already projected far into the garden of the manor, and lay but 50 yards from the south front of the house. On that side of the churchyard, therefore, the new wall was set back. Running from the north to the nearest corner of the church, it was there built up to the church itself, and then continued from the southern corner, leaving the eastern wall and window within the garden of the squire. It was his ivy that clung to the wall of the church, and his trees that shaded the window from the morning sun. Whilst we have been recalling these facts, Mr. Batchel has made his way out of the church and through the churchyard, and has arrived at a small door in the boundary wall close to the southeast corner of the chancel. It was a door which some squire of the previous century had made to give convenient access to the church for himself and his household. It has no present use, and Mr. Batchel had some difficulty in getting it open. It was not long, however, before he stood on the inner side and was examining the second light of the window. There was a tolerably bright moon, and the dark surface of the glass could be distinctly seen, as well as the wirework placed there for its protection. A tall birch, one of the trees of the old churchyard, had thrust its lower boughs across the window, and their silvery bark shone in the moonlight. The boughs were bare of leaves, and only very slightly interrupted Mr. Batchel's view of the Baptist's figure, the leaden outline of which was clearly traceable. There was nothing, however, to account for the movement which Mr. Batchel was curious to investigate. He was about to turn homewards in some disappointment when a cloud obscured the moon again, and reduced the light to what it had been before he left the church. Mr. Batchel watched the darkening of the window and the objects near it, and as the figure of the Baptist disappeared from view, there came into sight a creamy vaporous figure of another person lightly poised upon the bough of the tree, and almost coincident in position with the picture of the saint. It could hardly be described as the figure of a person. It had more the appearance of half a person, and fancifully suggested to Mr. Batchel, who was fond of whist, one of the diagonally bisected knaves in a pack of cards, as he appears when another card conceals a triangular half of the bust. There was no question now of going home. Mr. Batchel's eyes were riveted upon the apparition. It disappeared again for a moment, when an interval between two clouds restored the light of the moon. But no sooner had the second cloud replaced the first than the figure again became distinct, and upon this its single arm was raised 3 times, pointing northwards towards the ruined house, just as the figure of the Baptist had seemed to point when Mr. Batchel had seen it from within the church. It was natural that upon receipt of this sign, Mr. Batchel should step nearer to the tree, from which he was still at some little distance, and as he moved, the figure floated obliquely downwards and came to rest in a direct line between him and the ruins of the house. It rested not upon the ground, but in just such a position as it would have occupied if the lower parts had been there, and in this position it seemed to await Mr. Batchel's advance. He made such haste to approach it as was possible upon ground encumbered with ivy and brambles, and the figure responded to every advance of his by moving further in the direction of the ruin. As the ground improved, the progress became more rapid. Soon they were both upon an open stretch of grass, which in better days had been a lawn, and still the figure retreated towards the building, with Mr. Batchel in respectful pursuit. He saw it at last, poised upon the summit of a heap of masonry, and it disappeared, at his near approach, into a crevice between 2 large stones. The timely reappearance of the moon just enabled Mr. Batchel to perceive this crevice, and he took advantage of the interval of light to mark the place. Taking up a large twig that lay at his feet, he inserted it between the stones. He made a slit in the free end and drew into it one of some papers that he had carried out of the church. After such a precaution, it could hardly be possible to lose the place, for of course Mr. Batchel intended to return in daylight and continue his investigation. For the present, it seemed to be at an end. The light was soon obscured again, but there was no reappearance of the singular figure he had followed. So after remaining about the spot for a few minutes, Mr. Batchel went home to his customary occupation. He was not a man to let these occupations be disturbed even by a somewhat exciting adventure, nor was he one of those who regard an unusual experience only as a sign of nervous disorder. Mr. Batchel had far too broad a mind to discredit his sensations because they were not like those of other people. Even had his adventure of the evening been shared by some companion who saw less than he did, Mr. Batchel would only have inferred that his own part in the matter was being regarded as more important. Next morning, therefore, he lost no time in returning to the scene of his adventure. He found his mark undisturbed, and was able to examine the crevice into which the apparition had seemed to enter. It was a crevice formed by the curved surfaces of 2 large stones, which lay together on the top of a small heap of fallen rubbish, and these 2 stones Mr. Batchel proceeded to remove. His strength was just sufficient for the purpose. He laid the stones upon the ground on either side of the little mound, and then proceeded to remove with his hands the rubbish upon which they had rested, and amongst the rubbish he found, tarnished and blackened, 2 silver coins. It was not a discovery which seemed to afford any explanation of what had occurred the night before, but Mr. Batchel could not but suppose that there had been an attempt to direct his attention to the coins, and he carried them away with a view of submitting them to a careful examination. Taking them up to his bedroom, he poured a little water into a hand basin and soon succeeded, with the aid of soap and a nail brush, in making them tolerably clean. 10 minutes later, after adding ammonia to the water, he had made them bright, and after carefully drying them was able to make his examination. They were 2 crowns of the time of Queen Anne, minted as a small letter E indicated at Edinburgh, and stamped with the roses and plumes which testified to the English and Welsh silver in their composition. The coins bore no date, but Mr. Batchel had no hesitation in assigning them to the year 1708 or thereabouts. They were handsome coins, and in themselves a find of considerable interest, but there was nothing to show why he had been directed to their place of concealment. It was an enigma, and he could not solve it. He had other work to do, so he laid the 2 crowns upon his dressing table and proceeded to do it. Mr. Batchel thought little more of the coins until bedtime, when he took them from the table and bestowed upon them another admiring examination by the light of his candle. But the examination told him nothing new. He laid them down again, and before very long had lain his own head upon the pillow. It was Mr. Batchel's custom to read himself to sleep. At this time he happened to be rereading the Waverley novels, and Woodstock lay upon the reading stand which was always placed at his bedside. As he read of the cleverly devised apparition at Woodstock, he naturally asked himself whether he might not have been the victim of some similar trickery, but was not long in coming to the conclusion that his experience admitted of no such explanation. He soon dismissed the matter from his mind and went on with his book. On this occasion, however, he was tired of reading before he was ready for sleep. It was long in coming, and then did not come to stay. His rest, in fact, was greatly disturbed. Again and again, perhaps every hour or so, he was awakened by an uneasy consciousness of some other presence in the room. Upon one of his later awakenings, he was distinctly sensible of a sound, or what he described to himself as the ghost of a sound. He compared it to the whining of a dog that had lost its voice. It was not a very intelligible comparison, but still it seemed to describe his sensation. The sound, if we may so call it, caused him first to sit up in bed and look well about him, and then, when nothing had come of that, to light his candle. It was not to be expected that anything should come of that, but it had seemed a comfortable thing to do, and Mr. Batchel left the candle alight and read his book for half an hour or so before blowing it out. After this there was no further interruption, but Mr. Batchel distinctly felt, when it was time to leave his bed, that he had had a bad night. The coins, almost to his surprise, lay undisturbed. He went to ascertain this as soon as he was on his feet. He would almost have welcomed their removal, or at any rate some change which might have helped him towards a theory of his adventure. There was, however, nothing. If he had in fact been visited during the night, the coins would seem to have had nothing to do with the matter. Mr. Batchel left the 2 crowns lying on his table on this next day, and went about his ordinary duties. They were such duties as afforded full occupation for his mind, and he gave no more than a passing thought to the coins, until he was again retiring to rest. He had certainly intended to return to the heap of rubbish from which he had taken them, but had not found leisure to do so. He did not handle the coins again. As he undressed, he made some attempt to estimate their value, but without having arrived at any conclusion, went on to think of other things, and in a little while had lain down to rest again, hoping for a better night. His hopes were disappointed. Within an hour of falling asleep, he found himself awakened again by the voiceless whining he so well remembered. This sound, as for convenience we will call it, was now persistent and continuous. Mr. Batchel gave up even trying to sleep, and as he grew more restless and uneasy, decided to get up and dress. It was the entire cessation of the sound at this juncture which led him to a suspicion. His rising was evidently giving satisfaction. From that it was easy to infer that something had been desired of him, both on the present and the preceding night. Mr. Batchel was not one to hold himself aloof in such a case. If help was wanted, even in such unnatural circumstances, he was ready to offer it. He determined accordingly to return to the manor house, and when he had finished dressing, descended the stairs, put on a warm overcoat, and went out, closing his hall door behind him, without having heard any more of the sound, either whilst dressing or whilst leaving the house. Once out of doors, the suspicion he had formed was strengthened into a conviction. There was no manner of doubt that he had been fetched from his bed, for about 30 yards in front of him he saw the strange creamy half-figure making straight for the ruins. He followed it as well as he could. As before, he was impeded by the ivy and weeds, and the figure awaited him. As before, it made straight for the heap of masonry, and disappeared as soon as Mr. Batchel was at liberty to follow. There were no dungeons or subterranean premises beneath the manor house. It had never been more than a house of residence, and the building had been purely domestic in character. Mr. Batchel was convinced that his adventure would prove unromantic, and felt some impatience at losing again what he had begun to call his triangular friend. If this friend wanted anything, it was not easy to say why he had so tamely disappeared. There seemed nothing to be done but to wait until he came out again. Mr. Batchel had a pipe in his pocket, and he seated himself upon the base of a sundial within full view of the spot. He filled and smoked his pipe, sitting in momentary expectation of some further sign, but nothing appeared. He heard the hedgehogs moving about him in the undergrowth, and now and then the sound of a restless bird overhead. Otherwise all was still. He smoked a second pipe without any further discovery, and that finished, he knocked out the ashes against his boot, walked to the mound near to which his label stick was lying, thrust the stick into the place where the figure had disappeared, and went back to bed, where he was rewarded with 5 hours of sound sleep. Mr. Batchel had made up his mind that the next day ought to be a day of disclosure. He was early at the manor house, this time provided with the gardener's pick and a spade. He thrust the pick into the place from which he had removed his mark, and loosened the rubbish thoroughly. With his hands and with his spade, he was not long in reducing the size of the heap by about 1/2, and there he found more coins. There were 3 more crowns, 2 half-crowns, and a dozen or so of smaller coins. All these Mr. Batchel wrapped carefully in his handkerchief, and after a few minutes' rest went on with his task. As it proved, the task was nearly over. Some strips of oak about 9 inches long were next uncovered, and then what Mr. Batchel had begun to expect, the lid of a box with the hinges still attached. It lay face downwards upon a flat stone. It proved when he had taken it up to be almost unsoiled, and above a long and wide slit in the lid was the gilded legend, "For ye poor," in the graceful lettering, and the redundant spelling of 2 centuries ago. The meaning of all this Mr. Batchel was not long in interpreting. That the box and its contents had fallen and been broken amongst the masonry was evident enough. It was as evident that it had been concealed in one of the walls brought down by the fire, and Mr. Batchel had no doubt at all that he had been in the company of a thief who had once stolen the poor box from the church. His task seemed to be at an end. A further rummage revealed nothing new. Mr. Batchel carefully collected the fragments of the box and left the place. His next act cannot be defended. He must have been aware that these coins were treasure trove, and therefore the property of the crown. In spite of this, he determined to convert them into current coin, as he well knew how, and to apply the proceeds to the inundation fund, about which he was so anxious. Treating them as his own property, he cleaned them all, as he had cleaned the 2 crowns, sent them to an antiquarian friend in London to sell for him, and awaited the result. The lid of the poor box he still preserves as a relic of the adventure. His antiquarian friend did not keep him long waiting. The coins had been eagerly bought, and the price surpassed any expectation that Mr. Batchel had allowed himself to entertain. He had sent the package to London on Saturday morning. Upon the following Tuesday, the last post in the evening brought a cheque for 20 guineas. The brief subscription list of the inundation fund lay upon his desk, and he at once entered the amount he had so strangely come by, but could not immediately decide upon its description. Leaving the line blank, therefore, he merely wrote down £21 in the cash column, to be assigned to its source in some suitable form of words when he should have found time to frame them. In this state he left the subscription list upon his desk when he retired for the night. It occurred to him, as he was undressing, that the 20 guineas might suitably be described as a restitution, and so he determined to enter it upon the line he had left vacant. As he reconsidered the matter in the morning, he saw no reason to alter his decision, and he went straight from his bedroom to his desk, to make the entry and have done with it. There was an incident in the adventure, however, upon which Mr. Batchel had not reckoned. As he approached the list, he saw, to his amazement, that the line had been filled in. In a crabbed, elongated hand was written, "At last, St. Matthew, verse 26. What may seem more strange is that the handwriting was familiar to Mr. Batchel. He could not at first say why. His memory, however, in such matters was singularly good, and before breakfast was over he felt sure of having identified the writer. His confidence was not misplaced. He went to the parish chest, whose contents he had thoroughly examined in past intervals of leisure, and took out the roll of parish constable's accounts. In a few minutes he discovered the handwriting of which he was in search. It was unmistakably that of Salathiel Thrapston, constable from 1705 to 1710, who met his death in the latter year, whilst in the execution of his duty. The reader will scarcely need to be reminded of the text of the Gospel at the place of reference. "Thou shalt by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing." The end. Thank you for listening to The Eastern Window by E.G. Swain. Although never as widely celebrated as M.R. James, Swain deserves recognition as one of the finest writers of the classic English ghost story. Drawing upon his own experience as a parish priest, he infused his tales with an authenticity that few authors could match, capturing not only the architecture and traditions of England's ancient churches, but also the quiet mystery that seems to linger within them. If you enjoyed this story, you'll find many more forgotten classics here on Haunted Tales of Darkness, where we continue to revive the finest supernatural fiction of the Victorian, Edwardian, and early 20th century, alongside original tales inspired by those enduring traditions. If you would like to support the channel, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment and sharing this video with fellow lovers of classic ghost stories. Your support helps preserve these remarkable works for future generations. Until next time, thank you for listening. And remember, not every ancient window looks only upon the world outside. For several years, I've devoted myself to creating original ghost stories, strange tales, atmospheric narrations, and supernatural fiction through Haunted Tales of Darkness. What many people perhaps do not realize is the amount of work involved behind the scenes, the writing, editing, research, recording, artwork, publishing, and production that goes into trying to create something worthy of the great tradition of classic supernatural storytelling. I continue to do it because I genuinely love the work, Some months ago, however, YouTube effectively removed my ability to earn revenue from the channel, claiming that my content was somehow inauthentic. I was far from alone in this, as many other readers, writers, and narration channels were similarly affected. Ironically, this has happened at a time when the platform itself is increasingly flooded with AI-generated material. Part of the issue, I suspect, is that YouTube strongly favours midstream advertising, which is completely at odds with the kind of immersive storytelling experience I try to create. Interrupting a ghost story midway through with loud advertising breaks the atmosphere and destroys the flow for both reader and listener alike. A number of people have asked whether there is another way to support the channel and my writing directly, and that would be by supporting me through Patreon for anyone who wishes to help support future stories, books, narrations, and projects. There is absolutely no obligation, of course. Watching, listening, commenting, and sharing the work already helps enormously. But for those who would like to contribute monthly or simply leave the occasional gift of support, it would be deeply appreciated and would directly help me continue creating new material. Thank you to everyone who has followed and supported Haunted Tales of Darkness over the years.